All right, let's talk about the ID and ID ref and ID refs um, functionality that DTDs offer. IDs are a way to enforce an attribute name that the value inside that name is indeed unique. So you can create a attribute name, and any value that goes in there has to be a unique value. If it's not, the document will not validate. That's a handy thing to do just in general. But one of the things that ID and ID refs allow you to do is to turn your XML documents into sort of database-like documents. With XML, you can do database or table-like structuring of your data. We don't delve into it too much, but there's a whole sort of body of literature out there of XML as databases, and but just so you know that you can go much deeper with that. But what we're going to do here is just basically look at a way that we can actually structure our XML document so that one piece of data has to coordinate with another piece of data. So here we have an ID, a unique ID, and we have a set of wonders here. We only have so many ancient wonders, right? So each ancient wonder is going to get a unique value for its code. And then we have resources that have been either web resources, or you could think of book resources that have been written about these ancient wonders. So you have sort of a many to one relationship. You can only have one ancient wonder, but you could have many resources written about that ancient wonder. So up here we have a wonder code, and then the code is set equal to this unique value here. And then inside of that we have name, because remember, inside in our document type definition we can create a sequence where we put name inside a wonder, then name gets defined down here. But inside of, or as name in our value, we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and then the other one we have the statue of Zeus at Olympia. Down here we have, and so we have an ID for each one of those wonders. Down here we have a resources section. It's sort of like a table of data. Special site is our element, and then that attribute is an ID ref, and we'll show you how you set that up over there. But basically what this does is it shows a connection to this ancient wonder. So W_143, the parser will look through it when it's validating the XML document and look that indeed this does refer to an ID over there. So you have ID ref, it's referring ID ref back to the ID. So over here, let's look at how we set that up. Much of the stuff up front, we've already looked at that. This is the new one. We have Atlas Wonder code. This would normally be CData if we were just going to bang out a normal attribute, but this is not a normal attribute. It's an attribute that needs to have a unique value. So what we do here is Atlas Wonder, because that's the element that this attribute is going to be inside of, the attribute name code, which we have here. And then we're going to set its like data type, if you will, to ID, and then we're going to make it required. And this is, you have to pretty much follow that to the T. The only thing that would be different is, you know, you're not going to have wonder or code. It could be any other element or attribute name, depending on what you're marking up. So we've set that to unique. So if I, for some reason, did something like this and do 143, save it, and I run this or validate it, we should get an error if I go to validate it, and indeed it says 143 already defined. And then on top of it, we'll get to this in a second, but it says that this ID ref is looking for an ID to refer to, and it cannot find it because I just deleted it up there. So let's put that back, save it, validate again, and indeed it's valid. Let's do the same down here. Well, let's talk about ID ref and ID, well, just ID ref right now. here, this is just so you know, the author puts these comments in there just so you can know that this is the part of the code snippet that you'll see in the book. We have our little special site, our sort of resources area, if you will. It's kind of like a table. Just again, we're not doing databases, but this is, if you think of that way and it helps, then go ahead. But we're just defining more elements. So we have resources here, right? Inside of that, we have special site, and then inside a special site, we have title and URL. Special site is also going to get an attribute created for it. So we have @list, special site, and then Wonder Focus. Kind of a funny names here, but anyways, that's our attribute name right here. And then we're going to set that data type, if you will, or its parameter. Data type, I think, is the best one, to ID ref. So any value that goes inside of Wonder Focus has to basically point to and find an ID that's already been created. So we saw when we deleted this one, when 284 had nothing to go to, it created an error, a validation error. So this ID ref makes it refer back. So again, you can have this kind of one-to-many or many-to-one relationships. Again, that's something you would talk a lot about with like keys and foreign keys in a database course. This is some of the functionality that document type definitions offer. Again, this little recipe for it, you pretty much have to follow it to the T. The only thing that's going to be a little different is these two sections or variables here. Again, it's going to depend on what the element it is and then what the attribute name. So that's ID and ID refs. All right, let's talk about ID refs, and that's refs with an S at the end, as in Sam. Very similar to doing ID and ID ref. What this allows us to do is to basically set up a unit of information or a record, if you will, and have it refer to many IDs. So rather than a one-to-many as we had in the previous example, we have potential many-to-many references here, relationships. So the ID is set up in a very similar way where you have an ID value set equal to an attribute. In this case it's code, so we have ID there. But down here we have our ID refs, and it's very similar, but there's a slight difference, and that is when you use this data type ID refs, that it has an S at the end, as in Sam. Again, very similar situation where you pretty much have to follow this recipe to the T. These are going to change, obviously, for whatever element you're using or attribute name, but everything else should be the same if you're doing ID refs. And let's just look at it in the XML example. Here we have essentially our table, if you will, our unit of information or our unit of elements, our wonders, and they're all unique, right? There's only one Hanging Gardens of Babylon, so it gets a unique ID, and same way the statue of Zeus at Olympia gets one ID. But we happen to have a resource here. We have a book title or a website title, Wonder of the World, and then we have a URL there that goes out to that resource. But this resource, as you can see, is like an encyclopedia or some kind of general resource on wonders of the world. So it has to refer not to just one, to both of them to show that that relationship is multiple, so hence ID refs. All right, let's look at name tokens. Name tokens are kind of a peculiar way to restrict data in document type definitions, but we need to talk about them. Basically, it's a way to restrict the data that's put in a as an attribute value, to restrict it to only valid XML syntax. So what that means for you and I is that an attribute that goes in there needs to basically have only letters and numbers and underscores and no spaces. It's a very, very weak, limited way to type your data or to control it, but it does give you some control nonetheless. So we have three documents here. We have our DDT. Let's move that over to the other Y here, and we have two XML documents. One's valid and one's not. These are right out of the book, but as I mentioned before, these are the ones in the book are code snippets. If you go and download the examples from the author's website, you'll get all of them, and they're fun to work with, and they're really, I highly recommend that you work through these examples on your own, because it's one of the best ways to kind of figure out how to do all this stuff rather than just purely relying on reading the text or my videos. And it's best, again, as we've talked about before, that you do some of these examples before you do an exercise or a homework. It just makes it a much richer experience all around. Okay, so we have our DDT over here, and we have various elements and attributes defined, and we will have a name token that is defined, and it's all the way down at the bottom here. Let's just bring it onto one line. I just kind of like that. It doesn't have to be that way, but again, we have an element, and it's wVisit, and then we have a attribute here, wVisit, for the element that it's in, and then the attribute name, which is primary keyword, and then name token. This is the data type, if you will, of what value can be put in primary keyword, and again, it's required. So this is the recipe for that. So let's look at this. We have two XML examples. They both link to, let's save that. They both link to this 06-35.ddt file. Up here you can see, right? They both go to that. One's valid and one's not. So let's look. Is this one valid? Okay, yes, that one's valid. And we go here, validate, and no. This one says syntax of value for attribute primary keyword of, this is the element, wVisit, is not valid. So let's look at it and find out why it's not valid. Let's just look at it again. So it doesn't give you a line number, unfortunately, but it says attribute for primary keyword. So let's find primary keyword. Okay, here we go. Primary keyword. That's your attribute, and then you have your value. Well, we know in XML syntax that spaces are not allowed, so we could just do that if we wanted to. Run the validator, and it's valid. We could do something like this if we wanted to. That would make it valid. Save it, validate, and indeed it's valid. Just a note, another note about validation and running the validator. Both your of your files need to be in the same directory. You cannot have your .ddt file in one folder and your XML file in another unless you specify it up here. My advice to you, if you're doing an exercise or a homework, you just create a folder called exercise 3 or homework 1 or 2 or whatever, and put both your files in there. Don't get them spread out, because this will go looking for it and it can't find it unless it's in the same directory.